So we have a session this afternoon where we're going to have talk about risk and reward, which are two things that we often don't put together. So I want you to have a look at this. And in particular, I want you to look at the last sentence. For survival, yes. Embraced for survival. And it's a really important concept for us to have, because when we talk about risk in the vet sector, we very rarely talk about embracing risk for survival. So you can go to any business school in the world and they will tell you that the greatest risk to organisations is missed opportunity. And when we focus on the very negative things to do with risk, we do tend to miss opportunity. Now, risk is a word that's been around for a very long time, and in fact it's derived from an Arabic word which means exactly what you see up there: anything that has been given to you by God and by which you profit. So quite literally, in 900 years, we've gone from a situation where we've thought about risk as a gift from God to thinking about risk as something that we're going to use a lot of data to analyse, and we think about it with a very much an avoidance feel to it. The whole idea is avoid risk. And when we do that, we have a very negative flavour and we do miss the things that are there for us. So we work in a sector where we have a risk-based approach. It's a very safe mouse we've got up there. A very safe little mouse. So we work in a risk-averse sector. There's no two ways about that. Our regulators, whether we're talking about TAC or whether we're talking about ASQA, is there anyone in the room who's regulated by the VRQA? No? Well, that's a bonus. Have both adopted a risk-based approach. And so risk-based approaches have been around since the 80s and 90s. And at that time when we were looking at implementing risk-based approaches in regulation, it was seen as a bit of a solution to what they thought of as over-regulation, as a whole lot of red tape. And if we could implement a risk-based approach, then as the public, we would actually get the best value for our money, the best bang for our buck out of these risk type approaches. So in the UK and in the US, it was adopted in a very big way. And you'll see the governance structures are set up like that and they use risk-based tools. And more so Canada and Australia now are also implementing risk-based approaches in regulation. And it's very much an approach that allows our regulators to focus on the things that they see as having the most negative impact on the outcomes that they want for the sector. So ASQA, for example, lists their primary risk as managing RTOs certifying that a person has competencies that do not reflect his or her skills or knowledge. So you certify someone who actually can't do the job. And when you have a look at the feedback that we get from industry about what we do in this sector, then that is the feedback that a lot of industry provide to us. And when you have a look at all of the changes that are happening in our sector, a lot of that is actually about mitigating that risk. So when we work in a sector where we do have this risk-based approach in place and both regulators have a risk framework that they work within, TAX is about to be published, ASQA's has already been published, then we need to think about actually how those things apply in our organisations, how we can use risk management as a positive tool for our organisations, but also understand how the regulator is going to deal with us. So I guess the really important thing for me to say up front is risk is contextual. Okay, what is a risk to you and your organisation, either in terms of something that could potentially harm you or something that could offer you opportunity, will not be perceived in the same way in another organisation. So this is another one of those things in our sector where there is no one right answer. Okay, there's lots and lots of different answers. So we have to understand the context within which we are going to operate. Then we'll go through the process that you typically see in organisations, in that they put a label on a risk management where they identify some risks, they analyse those risks, they put some kind of treatment program in place, and they monitor what happens with that treatment program. So when we go through this kind of process, we have to make sure that when we're looking at risks, we're looking at those things that would also provide us opportunity, not just those things that might in fact harm our businesses. Now, on the sheets in front of you, and you'll find that you've got 3 sheets in front of you, you'll see the first one there talks about context. So it says, what's your context? Each one of you is going to be different. Maybe some of you work for the same organisation, and therefore you might have similar impacts. But for each of us, we have things that are external to our organisation that impact on us, and we have things that are internal to our organisation. Some examples might be external impactors could be things like government policy. So if we think about some things that have changed in our sector recently, maybe think about high school qualifications. So if you're not going to go to university, you're going to exit high school with at least 1 Certificate 2 qualification. Government policy, it's external to your organisation, and it offers you potential opportunity and potentially something that could be harmful to you. Internally, it could be something like you have geographically dispersed staff. So your staff are spread all over the state. What does that mean for you? It could be that you have very stable staff. What does that mean for you in terms of what you do? So without having that clear picture of the context within which you operate, it becomes very hard to then identify those things that really might be opportunity or a threat for your organisation. So what I want you to do now is to spend a little bit of time in your groups actually identifying those things that might be your context. So what are those external impactors in your organisation, and what are those internal impactors on your organisation? And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do that. Okay, so I'll bring your attention back now, please. You've all got lots of things on your lists. Okay, so I'd like to invite some of you to share some of the things that you have put on your list. So do we have a volunteer? If you don't volunteer, I'm going to volunteer you, by the way.
So I'm from what is now Central Regional TAFE. So that's one of the position that I hold is a principal lecturer. So a huge risk for us, which we sort of discussed as being probably imposed externally but now having to be managed internally, was basically the merging of 3 organisations. Yes. And all that entails. And yes. I guess we see that as, you know, it is a risk. Obviously, if we get it wrong or if we don't do it in a timely manner, then we open ourselves up to huge risk. But also just taking on board that positive kind of aspect, what a great opportunity to... Yes. You know, review the way that we operate. Yes. and to learn from each other and that kind of stuff. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Incredible opportunity, in fact, for all of the new entities. Anyone else like to volunteer? Some things that might have been on their external? Sharon.
I put down regional demographics because I'm from Central Regional TAFE, principal lecturer, and we might sometimes have to operate in very thin markets. Yes. But we also have clientele who might have very high-level needs. Yes. So it's a challenge for us to be able to support them with their literacy and numeracy. Yes. And other, services that they might require. So I put that down as
excellent
as a risk, but it's also an opportunity for us to develop skills within our regional contexts.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
New technologies can be a risk and can be a reward.
Yes.
In itself. The new funding model will be decided whether that's a risk or a reward.
Yep.
Doubting will be rewarded.
You never know. We're, unexpected gift from God. You never know. Now we've had 3 TAFE colleges speak so far, so how about a non-TAFE person volunteering? Thank you.
And I've put down as, I guess, an external threat risk would be competitors' movement. So say someone were to come out and say, we offer that course in half the time, come and do it with us. That's a threat to us. And
it is. It's a threat to everybody, that. Yes.
Yeah, just looking at we're starting to spread geographically, so going to isolated locations, small communities.
Yes.
So that's certainly, one is a risk, but two can be rewarding. Yep.
Absolutely, it can be for a lot of people. So you can see how starting to look at those things that exist internally and externally to your organisation then allows you to start thinking about what might the risks be associated with this context that we are operating in now. And the context that we are operating in now, all of us, is in fact extremely changeable. Now, turn over to the next page on your sheets. And what you'll see is there's a list of 9 questions there. I'm sure in some culture that's a lucky number. So this is about really getting to the heart of what the risks are for your organisation. And so each of these questions is aimed at, once you've identified something that you see as a risk, whether that be something that potentially will facilitate harm in your organisation or will actually offer you opportunity in your organisation, how do you then pull that apart so that you can make a good choice about what type of action you might take in your organisation to manage that risk? So, and I'm not going to read those questions out to you because I'm sure you can all read them yourselves, but what I'm going to do is actually get you to work on this in your groups. Now, what I want you to do is to think about, in your context, what is one thing that is an opportunity for your organisation and what is one thing that could potentially facilitate harm for your organisation. And then what I want you to do is to work through those 9 questions for those 2 things. What's one good thing? What's one potentially harmful thing for your organisation? Work through those 9 questions.
Yes, so I just wanted to say it is a really useful checklist.
Yes, it is, because you think about things in a different way when you pull them apart, when you pull the details apart. And really all you're doing here is identification of risk. I mean, we're not analysing things. We're getting some more information about what it is we're thinking about in terms of the risks to our business, but we're not analysing them yet. So we're getting some ideas about who else might be involved, about when these things might happen, so that we can get to a point where we can analyse it, where we can evaluate it and decide if we have to take some action. And of course there are going to be plenty of times in there where you will have a look at that process and you'll say, in fact, this risk is quite tolerable for me and I'm not going to do anything. But analysis is next. So, generally to analyse things, you need some data. Now pick that image for a very specific purpose because it looks a little bit chaotic, right? This is your new worst best friend who's given you this jigsaw puzzle. And you all know I spend a lot of time in different RTOs, and when I have a look at the way RTOs look at data collection and the way they use data, this is often what I see. There is not a cohesive picture about how data is actually managed or looked at or collected. Now I see rainforests, and I mean literally rainforests of paper. And when you talk to people about what they've done with that paper, sometimes you get responses like, we've changed our caterer. So, yes, that's great. We're going to have a hot lunch, but hey, is your business actually achieving its objectives? Now, we have a situation in our sector where there are some compulsory data collection activities that go on. So we all collect the quality indicator data, we all have to have complaints processes, we all do validation, and we have a standard within our regulation now that says you will collect this data and you will use it to evaluate. But a lot of the data that we collect through those processes is what I would call very vanilla data. And those of you who've been to presentations from me before will have heard me use that word, because vanilla always goes with something else, doesn't sit by itself. Okay. But what happens in our sector is we don't do the something else. We tend not to do the something else. And when you have a look at what you get from the compulsory data collection, you will often not have enough information to actually make a good decision about what to do from that data. So we need to think much, much more carefully about data collection in our sector. And you might not be surprised to know that that's the next activity that I'm going to get you to do. So on the third page, can I borrow yours, Viv? On the third page, you've got a table that looks something like that. Now, what I want you to do with the information that you collected through the analysis process is start to think about, if you were to really need to analyse and make decisions about what you're going to do with this data, with the risks that you identified, what data would you actually need to do that? What information would you need to collect to help you make decisions about what to do? So on this table, I also at this point only want you to think about the first 4 columns. So I want you to think about what you already collect. So within your organisation, what data do you already collect? When do you get it? How do you get it? And how do you actually use that data now? And think about it in terms of those 2 risks that you've identified. So you've had a little bit of a chance to think about what kind of data you might collect related to the risks that you identified. We've got any volunteers to share information with us?
So we collect data on student satisfaction, and we deliver our Cert 4 in clusters, so it's after each cluster. And how do we do it? We do it by survey form, SurveyMonkey, but we also collect emails that people send spontaneously. And then how we use it, we would adjust the delivering or assessment as a result of the satisfaction.
Okay, and what was the risk that you identified that was associated with that?
Well, the risk for that is that if the students they could be not satisfied with the way that we're delivering it, or it could be the time that we're delivering it, it could be the actual facilitator that we've got in front. So all of those things would be, and I guess the risk is if they're not satisfied, well then they're not going to come back again. Or,
exactly. There's plenty of other RTOs out there offering the same qualification.
Yes.
So how do you differentiate yourself in not a thin market, but in a very thick and crowded market? Yes, thank you. Anybody else would like to share?
The area we identified was, I suppose, changes in the funding arrangements, which can impact upon our RTO significantly. So I have data in a number of different forms. Data on numbers of commencements, completions, numbers in training, caseloads per caseload sizes.
Yep.
Performance outcomes, I find those all fairly good. I can analyse down to a qualification level, what income comes from those areas. They're all sort of the macro reports, but I also find fairly useful. We do have regular meetings between our coordinator and the caseloaders.
Yep.
I will sit in on some of those. It gives me a feel for how the students are progressing, how often they're being contacted, what support they're getting, what their progress is. We also have these sort of learner and employer satisfaction surveys. I find those less useful than the report that might come in saying that the person is not totally happy with the service, and we are able to identify, whether we're allowed to or not, who that student is, and we can go back to that student or to that employer and ask the question, well, what are you not happy with as far as the service is concerned? So it's almost that individual one, the personal side of the one-on-one, that gives me a lot of information about our services.
Yes, absolutely. And for most organisations to do a good job with data, they need to do exactly what you have just talked about, Jeff, and that there's going to be some quantitative things that you're going to get your hands on, and there's also going to need to be some qualitative things and the ability to drill down into the data. So for a lot of people, for example, when they're using the quality indicator data, they can't drill down into it because they haven't differentiated, for example, to qualification or to maybe a lecturer that might be delivering against it. So it's really important to have a nice mix that you can use to make a good decision with, because you're going to use all of this data that you gather to evaluate your options and decide what treatment you might put in place. It's not because you're all excellent, you're all 10s. We all know that. So evaluation is a word that is now in our standards. So our standards not only say that you collect this data, but they also say that you use it to evaluate the strategies and practices that you put in place. So it's not just about bits of paper. That word practices changes the whole context of what we're looking at. So it's whether what you do works. So how do you evaluate whether what you do works? So often in doing that, you will find as you look at the data that is collected by your organisation, you won't have enough data to make a good decision with. And that's what the last column on that sheet is about. If you're thinking about, have I got enough data that I can use to evaluate what I'm doing and make a good decision with, is there anything that's missing? Now, maybe the answer to that is no. But quite potentially the answer to that is yes as well. So that's what I want you to do now, to think about in the context of the risks that you identified, is there any other data that you actually need to enable you to evaluate what your options might be and make a good decision about what to do? A couple of minutes to think about that. Okay. So you've had an opportunity now to think about what other data you might need to actually help you make good decisions about what you're going to do, about what your options are. So some people, as I've walked around, when I have had a look at that column, there's not a lot written in that column, in which case I'm really happy for you because maybe you've got the mix right. Other people have written quite a few things in that column that there is actually some more data that they would like to gather. And we had an interesting conversation over here where we talked about the fact that sometimes we have too much data and we really can't get to the core of what to do with it. So that is why that column, how do you use it, is sitting there. If you're collecting data that you don't use, I would ask you the question, why are you collecting it? Seems logical to me. Now, of course, there might be a very good reason. It might be that there's some requirement for your funding contract or there's some other regulator, but it might also be that's just the way it's always been done and so we're still doing it like that. So when you are, and feel free to use these tools however you want to, but when you're working through this process, it is a little bit of an iterative process, because as you start thinking about, what are the risks, what data do I collect, how am I going to use this information, you will in fact go around in circles a little bit. You will go around in circles. Now, of course, at some point we have to put all this together. So we have dealt with this today in quite a disjointed way. In fact, risk management and planning and thinking about your evaluation is something that should happen in and through, cascaded through, all of your planning processes. So this is not something that sits outside all of this as an isolated activity. It should be embedded in everything that you do. So you will find that as you think about planning, so let's say you have a new project that you're putting in place. So for example, it might be something like the creation of a new entity. Then there'll be some things that you need to think about evaluative-wise, and therefore what kind of data you're going to get around the risks associated with that we're going to be thinking about right up front, not at the end of the process. So it must sit in your planning processes. Because then you're actually going to be able to make a good decision about this. And maybe your decision is, I'm not going there. Okay? So risk versus reward is about you being able to make a good decision about what is going to work and be successful in your organisation. I'm willing to open the floor up to any comments or questions. I know that's a risky approach on my part. Open the floor to any questions that you might have. So please just pop your hand up if you've got a question. We'll get you the microphone.
So the question is in relation to the data, and you're talking about data and the quality of the data and all that sort of stuff. And like, from your experience, you know, why is the data so incorrect to mean kind of thing across states and across, you know, territories and things like that, which then causes risk to mean kind of thing because the numbers aren't right to mean kind of thing. So is it going to improve to mean kind of thing? Do you think it's going to get better in relation to what you were mentioning before about, you know, okay, you've got this data, now you've got to report. What are you doing about it?
Yes. Well, Shane, I think some part of that is that we haven't had good systems in place to actually collect the data and analyse the data. And certainly on the part of the regulators, they're getting better, they're getting more sophisticated systems that enable them to actually use the information and not just use the quantitative information that they get, but the qualitative information, which really is what puts context around it, to enable them to implement their risk-based approach. So there's no doubt that as we're getting more sophisticated systems, they will get more benefit from using it. But we also have the problem that the data they get is what is given to them. So there are errors, there's no doubt about it. There are errors in the data that they get. The Total Vet Activity project was about trying to refine, you know, what it is we collect and how we use it. But fundamentally, at an RTO level, I think a lot of RTOs don't really think too much about the data they collect. They collect what they have to be compliant, not what they need to make good business decisions. And that's really what needs to change at our level. Any other questions you'd like to ask? Okay. Now, so I know you can't see it very well, but for those of you who are regulated by ASQA, they do have their regulatory risk framework that's downloadable off their website. That framework explains the risk indicators that they are using when they evaluate you as an RTO. Obviously, the higher risk you are, the better friends you become with the regulator. The lower risk you are, sometimes they're even willing to transfer some of their functions to you. So, for example, you might be an ASQA delegate. TAC is going through the same process right now. They have an external project where there will be a similar type of document that will be released. They're looking at that happening around September, October this year. So there's quite a bit of information out there, and I would encourage you to use risk wisely in your organisation. Take advantage of the opportunities. So thank you for coming this afternoon, and maybe I'll see you next session.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.